I won't tell you what caused me to look up the statistic, but there is a commercial that I saw and I went, oh, that's interesting. I wonder, let me see if I can find out some more information on that. But I found a statistic the other day, 46% of Americans do not have any savings for retirement. 46% of Americans do not have any savings for retirement. No savings, none. Those who are aged 50 to 55, so in other words, those who are about a decade away or so from retirement, 35% of those have less than $100,000 put away for retirement. And in most places in the U.S., that means maybe 2 or 3 years that they might be able to survive with that little bit of money if they were to retire. That's not much. I've been told, at least my understanding is that if you are 18 years old, so young people, listen, if you are 18 years old and you put aside $5,000, if you will invest $5,000 every year for the first 5 years of your adulthood, so from the age of 18 to 23, if you will just invest that in mutual funds or what have you, by the time you are to retire, you will be a multimillionaire, even if you put no more money in there for the rest of your life. Now, I know that $1 million doesn't buy what it used to, but it ain't nothing to sneeze at either, right? So the question then becomes, why is it that so few Americans, why is it that so few people are saving for retirement? Why is it even that so few college students or 18 to 23-year-olds, why are they not putting away that $5,000 for retirement? Why are they not looking to the future? Or maybe they are, but they're just not doing anything about it. Why? I think there are a few reasons maybe. It could be that just simply that they don't make enough, right? They're living paycheck to paycheck. They're just really not making enough. They're barely scraping by. They don't have any extra funds to be able to put away for retirement. Or it could be, again, if they're college students, that all their money is just pretty much going to college. They don't really have any extra income to be able to send off and to put it in some type of interest-bearing account. They just really don't have it. But I think also a lot of it is just simply that most people are short-sighted. And we only really think about the here and now. If we think about the future, we're thinking maybe a year or 2 years down the road. We're really not thinking about retirement age when we're 18 years old, or when we're 25 years old, or even when we're 35 years old. Most people don't seem to be thinking about that, because we just simply think about the here and now. What is it that we can attain with the money that we have now? And most people, we live in a very consumeristic world, consumeristic America. So we want all the latest stuff. We want all the latest gadgets. We want all the latest smartphones and the watches and the tablets. And we want to have our lattes every morning and whatever. We want all these different things, the greatest TVs and the nicest cars. And we would rather have a Tesla now than put all that money aside so that we can not have to worry about when we retire. That's kind of how we are. That's just what we do. We would rather have lesser pleasures now than greater pleasures later. It's just how we think. It just seems like it's all just with innate in us. We always intend to make it up, but rarely does anybody really ever do. And in fact, if you're trying to make up for what you could have done when you're 18 to 23 years old, there's no way that you can do that. The compound interest will not be the same. You will never reach what you could have if you started at 18. But we see that we don't even really make it up that much either, because we already saw between those who are within a decade of retirement have less than 35% of them have less than $100,000 saved up. So if that's the way it is, if that's how it is when really we think about that which is just 50 years away, or 40 or 30 or 20 or even 10, how much is it then that we are really giving any thought to eternity? To investing in eternity. This morning we're looking at what is considered by a lot of people, by many, maybe even most, to be the most difficult parable that Jesus ever told. is called, it has different names, but basically the parable of the unjust steward, unjust manager, the shrewd manager maybe. Different names for it, but it's basically the same thing, the dishonest manager. But what we see is because it is so easily misunderstood, then it is just as easily misapplied. And keeping in mind that Jesus is getting ever closer to the cross. Remember, he is on his way to Jerusalem. He has left Galilee. He is going through the cities, through the towns, making his way down to Jerusalem, knowing that he's about to be betrayed. He is spending most of the time, remember, there is not a whole lot of healing going on anymore. He's spending most of his time instructing. And he is instructing the crowds, but more importantly, as we see here today, he stops instructing the crowds and begins to start instructing his disciples. Because they need to know how they ought to prepare for eternity. He instructs his disciples to prepare for eternity with the wealth that they acquire in the here and now. And we see ultimately what we can learn from this as well, 3 principles that will help us to do just that. The first principle is that, first off, that we ought to be reducing the burden of others if and when we can. The second principle there is to really reallocate the resources of the master. And then lastly, the overall mindset that we ought to have, we need to rethink our temporal wealth with an eternal perspective. So reduce the burden of others, reallocate the resources of the master, and then rethink temporal wealth with eternal perspective. If you will, please stand for the honor of the reading of God's Word. Again, that's page 822, starting in chapter 16, verse 1, going till verse 9. He also said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my manager is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. Thank you. Be seated. So again, that first principle that we see in this parable that helps us to really focus on the eternal and prepare for the eternal is basically that we ought to be then reducing the burden of others if and when we can. And we can do it more often than we think that we could. The manager has hired somebody to care for his finances. He's some type of manager. We might call him a treasurer. We might call him an accountant. We might even just say that he was in collections somehow. But he was a guy that was supposed to take care of the master's money. But he wasn't on the up and up with the master. This guy was shrewd. He was a swindler. He basically has embezzled the money. And he's been caught. And he doesn't have a whole lot of time to act. And so he calls for those who owe his master. Let's look again, verses 4 through 7 here. I've decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. he said to him, take your bill and write down, and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. Now, ultimately, what this manager does is not commendable at all. His actions are absolutely 100% not commendable. Not only had he been cooking the books for himself, he was now cooking the books for his master's debtors. Those who actually owed his master money, he was cooking the books for them for their benefit. And yet what we see in verse 18 is that the master actually commends this manager for his shrewdness. And that's really key to understanding the parable. He's not commending him for his actions, he is commending him for his shrewdness. The actions were not commendable, but the fact that he was crafty, that he had this mindset, this shrewdness about him was commendable. That the master was basically saying, I got to give credit where credit is due. The guy has outfoxed me, he has outsmarted me. He did something, he was thinking outside the box, and I got to give credit where credit is due. He did something I never would have thought to do. So he gives him credit where credit is due. He commends him. But then we see going on to verse 9 that Jesus says that we, his disciples, those who are following after him, the sons of light, they're not nearly as commendable. We're not very good at this type of shrewdness, this type of planning. And so we see here first that this principle being born. We ought to be reducing the burden of others if and when we can. And that will help us to prepare for eternity. Now there's a major difference between this manager and us. One huge difference. This manager had no right to utilize his master's money for his own advantage. But we do. We do, if we use it in the right way. This is what Paul was getting at. Go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, but this is what Paul was getting at. There's the church in Jerusalem. I'm sorry, not 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. The church in Jerusalem has been going through some really difficult times. They were going through some hardships. They were in desperate need. And so a lot of the people at the church of Macedonia, they had already given in order to help meet the needs that were going on in Jerusalem. But now Paul is calling on the people of Corinth to basically to do the same, to put some money aside for those who are in Jerusalem because they are in need. And he makes this particular point in verse 8. Look at chapter 9, verse 8. Look at chapter 9, verse 8. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. In other words, God is gracious to us financially speaking. In the context of this, he is talking about our finances, that God has been gracious to us financially speaking. And he has done so with a twofold purpose. The first is to make sure that we have exactly what we need. The second is to take the excess and give it to somebody else who has need. Paul says that we have been given a sufficient amount of all things. Again, in context, what he means is all necessary things. The leftovers are for us to be given away to somebody else, that we may abound in every good work. Every good work, basically, of unburdening those around us. That's the context. That's what he's talking about. God has given you graciously so that you can have your needs met, and he has given you more than you need so that you can send some off to Jerusalem. But I want us to notice really the cycle here. Because here is this promise of God. God promises. Through Paul, God has promised to meet our needs and to give us leftovers for others. But if that is true, then why in the world do other people, other believers even, why do they need our money? Why do they need our resources? If God has given us, graciously given us, more than we could ever use, then why is it, if that's what the promise is to believers, why is it then that that really that anybody else needs our money? Why is it that the church at Corinth, why is it the church of Macedonia had to send money over to Jerusalem unless Jerusalem just isn't included in the promise of God? But if Jerusalem, as the believers in Jerusalem are part of the promise of God, that God will give to them graciously and so that they may abound in every good work, then why in the world was Corinth and why in the world was Macedonia in need of sending money to them in the first place? And the answer is just simply that's how God works. That's how He makes sure that we have more than enough. By supplying all the needs that come by means of God's grace, it at least in part comes by way of other believers. So when Jerusalem was in need, God was being faithful to His promise by sending them what they needed through Macedonia and through Corinth, so that when they received it, not only would they have enough, but according to this promise, they would actually have more than enough, that they also might be able to help others. See, there's going to be a time where we are in need, and God graciously will supply that need through our brothers and sisters in Christ. And when He does so, there is going to be more than enough so that we may be able to then give it to others who are in need as well. So we who are seeking eternal dwellings, in other words, we who are believers in Christ, we ought really to keep this principle in mind, that God has graciously given to us so that we may graciously give to others, that we may unburden them, that we may reduce the burden of others if and when we can. And again, we can more than we think. That leads us into the second principle. We're not only supposed to reduce the burden of others, we are supposed to reallocate the resources of the master. And these are similar, but I think that they're distinct enough that they warrant their own point. They're two different principles. Because again, what we see is that the manager begins to reallocate the master's resources. And in the corporate world, this would be illegal. You're not supposed to do that. But Christ isn't thinking of corporate world. He's thinking of His church. He's thinking of those who are looking for eternal dwellings. He's thinking of those who are His followers, those who are believers. And we have been given the master's resources, and He wants us then to reallocate them to others, to ourselves, and then to others. It's not only okay to reallocate the resources, but Jesus basically is saying here that we are expected to reallocate our resources, to reallocate the resources the Master has given to us. Let's look back at chapter 16, verse 8. The Master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness, for the sons of the world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. So here we have the sons of the world being contrasted with the sons of light. And this is really the only time that we see that the sons of this world, the sons of this age, are actually receiving more commendation than the sons of light. The sons who are non-believers, who are non-followers, are actually receiving more commendation than those who are followers of Jesus. Let that sink in. That's a sad fact. The sons of light are often much more naive when it comes to money matters. We tend to be too trusting at times. We tend to be untrusting at times. We swing the pendulum from one to the other. We tend to be too hesitant. We abjure risk. Many times we are more like the steward who received one coin, one talent, and buried it than we are like the one who received 2 or 5 and doubled their money. Sometimes we just think that we can't do anything because we can't do everything. And since we can't do everything, since we can't alleviate world hunger, since we can't stop people from starvation, since we can't stop the wars that are going on, we can't stop the famine, well, really, what is what is $5 going to give? What's $5 going to do? It's not going to do anything. So we just don't do anything. Some of us just tend to think that, we got to do the same for everybody, and if we can't do the same for everybody, then we really shouldn't do anything for anybody. But we as individuals, and we as a church, we're not called to do it all. And we are not called to be fair and treat everybody the same. We are called to be shrewd. We are called to be thoughtful. We are called to think outside the box. Look again. Let's go back to verse 6 and 7. Because I want us to see what the manager has done here. He said 100 measures a week. So the debtor, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to the other, and how much do you owe? He said 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. Did you notice that the manager did not treat the two debtors equally? Both of them owed 100 measures of something. One 100 measures of oil, one 100 measures of wheat. To the first one, he cuts off half of his debt. The other one, he only cuts off 20% of his debt. Did you notice that? He doesn't treat the two people the same. It may have been that the person who owed 100 measures of oil could only really afford to pay half of it, while the other one had a lot more money and a lot more resources than the other guy, so he cuts it only by 20% because he could afford more, but he cut it to what he could afford. Who knows what it was? It could be that he liked the first guy better than he liked the second guy. I don't know. It could have been that both of them basically came out to be the same amount of money. It's just oil cost less than wheat did. I have no idea. What I do know is that what we see is that they were not treated the exact same. We tend to think that we have to treat everybody the same. If I gave $10 here, I've got to give $10 there. If I gave this person $100 because they're in need, I got to give this person $100 over here. It's not true. We give what we can when we can. We reallocate the resources as we see fit. We think through it. We're supposed to be shrewd, cunning, thinking outside the box, deeply thinking about these things. Not everybody is going to have the same need as everybody else. And therefore, not everybody needs to be equally given as everybody else. So we need to keep that in mind as we reallocate the master's money. We're not called to be fair. We're called to be wise. We're called to be shrewd. And we are called to give to people as they have need and as God has graciously given us his resources. So again, that may be that somebody has $500 that they need. They need $500, and all we have is $5. That's like 1%. What good is $5 amongst $500? That's all we've got after paying our bills at the end of the month. We've just got $5 left over. But that $5 is leftovers that we have been graced with, that we may be able to reallocate from the master's grace account to us and deposit in a grace account to another. Just because we can't meet the full need doesn't mean that we don't join in and meet a portion of it. Again, as we reallocate the master's resources, we need to really start to consider our luxuries, because we got a lot of them. Just like maybe at the beginning you're like, yeah, maybe I don't necessarily need to have all the latest tech. Maybe I could wait a few years, save my money for retirement. Maybe the same could apply to our eternal dwellings as well. Reallocate those resources away from the latest smartphone or the latest watch or tablet, or maybe cut down to 1 or 2 lattes a week and just put that aside and just say, you know what, this is my grace account for others. It's a $6 latte. I'll just put $6 over here in this grace account, and when God gives me the opportunity to give it to somebody, I will give it to somebody. We need to consider our luxuries and see how we can reallocate what God has graced us with. But then there's a third principle that we need to look at. If we are really beginning to prepare ourselves for eternity, we really need to look at this third principle because it's the overarching emphasis here. We need to rethink our temporal wealth with eternal perspective. So let's go back again to the beginning of this parable. Because at the beginning of the parables, we see there is the master, and he is calling the manager to account. And let's look at verse 3. And the manager said to himself, "What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg." Do you see that the manager here, he stops actually thinking about the present, and he starts to think about his future? All of a sudden, things became very real to him. He may have enough for right now, but as soon as he is in judgment, as soon as the master gets the accounts, he is out of a job. He needs to stop thinking about what his life is like right now. He needs to start thinking about his life in the future when he has nothing of the master's resources to live on. All of a sudden, he has faced the reality that judgment day is coming. And this is something I think, again, that Christians fail to see. That the master is going to be calling us to account sooner than later. We always put that off. This manager was no longer in the position of being able to put that off. The time was now. He had to think about his future at this very moment. And so he began to think and to live, he began to live in his present situation based on the future reality. I find this really interesting in connection with the prodigal son. Because what we see here in verse 1, we see that the manager has wasted the master's money. And that word wasted there is the exact same word that we see during the prodigal son. I think it's in verse 13. 15:13, where it says squandering. He was squandering his dad's money. So here's a manager that is squandering his master's money, just like the prodigal son was squandering his dad's money. And here we have this manager who's looking at his situation. He realizes now that he is being called to account, and there is something that he needs to do. He needs to look to the future so that he can be prepared right now, because the future is coming quickly. But here is the son. He has wasted all of his money. He not once looked to the future. Not one time did he seek to make friends of this world so that when his money was gone, that he would be able to rely upon them. It's an interesting situation. They're doing the same thing at first. One changes his actions so he can change his present according to the future. And the other one says, I guess I will have to go and beg. Because the way that the text reads, he's basically begging to a Gentile man to let him feed the pigs. The manager says, I'm too proud to beg. I can't do hard labor. Let me think of a way that we can get through this, that I can get through this. So his last act was basically to change his methods, no longer use the master's money for present comfort, but use it for future blessings. So we see in verse 9 again, and I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. So Jesus is saying here to his disciples, utilize the unrighteous, utilize the temporary wealth here for eternal dwellings. Start thinking about it that way. Or as Randy Alcorn would say, he says, you can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. When we begin to rethink of our temporary wealth with eternal perspective, we begin to make friends really that we will never even know in this life. This is why Jesus changes the perspective. When the unjust manager, the shrewd manager there, he is seeking to make friends so that when he is out of a job, that he can go and be received into their houses. And Jesus says, that's really not the point. It's not about your retirement. It's not about really when you run out of money in this world. It is really what happens when everything is said and done and you are in heaven. Who is going to be there to receive you into eternal dwellings? What kind of friends have you made in this world by your money and by your resources that God has graciously bestowed upon you that you're going to eventually see in heaven? Because he says they will be there to receive us. They will greet us. They will welcome us into our eternal dwellings. So back in 1988, Ray Boltz, the singer Ray Boltz, had a song that he came out with. And sadly, Ray Boltz has abandoned the faith, but it doesn't make the song any less true, what he sang. And in it is a person who has had a dream that he has gone to heaven with a friend. And this friend is suddenly inundated with person after person thanking him for his work and his generosity on earth. And the second and third lines go like this. Then another man stood before you and said, remember the time a missionary came to your church. His pictures made you cry. You didn't have much money, but you gave it anyway. And Jesus took the gift you gave. And that's why I'm here today. Thank you for giving to the Lord. I am a life that was changed. Thank you for giving to the Lord. I am so glad you gave. And one by one they came, far as the eye could see, each life somehow touched by your generosity. The little things that you had done and the sacrifices made, unnoticed on the earth, but in heaven, now proclaim. I know up in heaven you're not supposed to cry, but I am almost sure there were tears in your eyes as Jesus took your hand and you stood before the Lord. He said, my child, look around you, for great is your reward. So as we close this section of Luke, we've really seen three principles here that would help us to prepare for eternity. The first is to reduce the burden of others. Second is to reallocate the resources of our master. And finally, to rethink the temporal wealth in light of eternity, with eternal perspectives. Jesus pointed to the fact, and even encouraged the fact, that this is really a win-win. Because when we begin to live in light of eternity with our wealth, there are people who will be won to Christ and will meet us there in heaven. They're won to Christ, and we are one with seeing a multitude of friends that we didn't even know that we had on earth. I mean, how amazing is it to be used by God in secret? So maybe for today, you might be thinking, I can make a commitment like that. I could do that. I can put a little bit of money aside when the time comes. Maybe I can stop a subscription to one of my streaming services. I don't really watch it anyway. I can stop that subscription, whatever that is, $9.99, $12.99, $15.99, whatever it is. I can just put that aside every month. And then when the opportunity comes, I can take it out of that grace account and give it to somebody else's grace account. I can go down to 2-3 lattes a week. I don't need 6 lattes a week. Just take that money, I'll just put it in a grace account that would help to reduce the burden of others. Or maybe there's something else, right? You could just shrewdly think Just think outside the box. Think with wisdom. Think outside the box of what God would have you to do. Maybe there's a way that you can reallocate those resources for somebody else, for somebody that's in need. Having this mindset that sees our eternal situation rather than our present one. Let's pray. Father, that is our prayer.